How Brexit Broke the UK Economy. The slow bankruptcy of a G7 giant. On the night of June 23, 2016, the rain hit the windows of trading floors from London to New York like fingers tapping a coffin. Most people think Brexit was a political rebellion, a flag-waving divorce driven by speeches and slogans. That story is comforting because it sounds like choice and control. But the ledger doesn't care about feelings, and the balance sheet doesn't vote. Here's the inversion you need to hold in your head. Britain didn't leave Europe and then struggle because it was awkward. Britain triggered a long, measurable slide toward insolvency because it weakened the machine that produces cash. This wasn't a single crash. It was a slow puncture. Then the steering wheel shaking. Then the corner you can't turn. Brexit didn't break the UK economy like a bomb. It broke it like a bad mortgage. Quietly, legally, and on paper. The moment the country chose friction over flow, the markets began pricing in a new word. Bankruptcy. Not the courtroom kind, but the national kind. The kind where a state doesn't collapse overnight, it simply can't afford to be itself anymore. Think of a nation like a company. It has revenue, costs, assets, and debt. It has suppliers and customers. It has a credit rating and a reputation that functions like oxygen. Britain's reputation used to be gold-plated. It was safe. It was grown up. It was the place where global money slept at night. Now picture what Brexit really did. It didn't take back control. It took away the easy money. It made trade slower, investment shakier, labor tighter, and pricing uglier. And when the cash engine slows, everything else becomes a fight. Wages, hospitals, schools, roads, heating, food. All of it becomes a negotiation with scarcity. Before we go into the spiral, you need to remember the illusion. Britain at its peak didn't just feel rich, it looked rich. The city of London glittered like a vault under a cathedral. Glass towers, black cars, champagne receipts. The pound carried itself like a heavyweight champion. There were parades of confidence, not on streets, but on spreadsheets. Global firms used London as their European command center. Lawyers, bankers, insurers, brokers. They didn't just sell services, they sold certainty. And certainty is a product with a high margin. You could feel that majesty in the everyday life too. Imported fruit in winter, cheap flights, new restaurants, a housing market that felt like a second salary. The country looked like it had cracked modern capitalism. It could buy what it didn't make and borrow what it didn't earn. But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. Britain wasn't living on steel and factories anymore. It was living on finance, property, and the belief that tomorrow's growth would pay for today's comfort. That belief is not an asset. It's a story. And stories collapse when the numbers stop agreeing. The real trap began earlier, in 2008, when the global financial crisis hit like a hammer through a glass floor. Britain's banking system didn't just wobble. It bled. A state can survive a lot of things, but it cannot survive without trust in its institutions. That crisis scarred the UK's productivity engine and left it weaker than it looked. After 2008, Britain became addicted to survival mode economics. Low interest rates became painkillers. Property inflation became the country's morphine drip. The state began treating symptoms while the disease ate muscle. Productivity stalled, investment became timid, and wages started to feel like they were stuck in wet cement. This is where the monster enters the story. Debt. Not as a number, but as a creature. A creature that grows when you feed it. A creature that whispers comfort in good times and demands blood in bad ones. Britain could carry debt because its credit was strong. But credit is a mood. And moods change. Then came austerity, a word that sounds clean, like discipline, like a doctor's plan. In practice, austerity is controlled starvation. It's when a state cuts the very investments that help it earn future revenue. Roads age, schools strain, hospitals clog. The balance sheet looks responsible, while the country's muscles shrink. By 2016, the patient was already sick. The public was exhausted, services were strained, and the political class was gambling. The referendum wasn't a rescue plan. It was a pressure valve, a way to settle an argument inside a party. But it wasn't the politicians who would pay. The night of the vote, markets were relaxed because they expected the status quo. The pound traded like a major currency should. Then the results began to bite, and investors did what investors always do when certainty dies. They ran, they sold, they protected themselves. The pound dropped hard. And when a currency drops, a nation pays a hidden tax. Imports cost more, fuel costs more, food costs more, components cost more. And because Britain imports a large share of what it eats, burns and builds with, a weaker pound doesn't just hurt pride. It hurts fridges. This is the first cut on the national balance sheet. Inflation rises, real wages fall, and the public doesn't notice instantly. They notice later, at the supermarket. They notice when the chocolate bar shrinks. They notice when rent rises again and their paycheck doesn't. Then came the second cut. Uncertainty. It sounds soft, like a cloud, but uncertainty is a weapon in economics. If you're a company and you don't know the rules for shipping goods, hiring workers, or complying with regulations, you freeze. You don't build the factory, you don't expand the warehouse, you don't take the risk. That freeze is the quiet killer. It doesn't show up as a dramatic crash. It shows up as empty future. The investment that never happened, the productivity improvement that never arrived, the wage growth that never became real. Britain didn't just lose money, it lost momentum. Now apply the rule of 3, because tragedy accelerates in threes. The currency fell, the investment froze, the confidence drained. Each one alone is survivable. Together they become a slow bankruptcy. For years after the vote, Britain entered a political loop that markets hate. Negotiations, resignations, leadership fights, threats of no deal, delays. Every headline became a risk factor, and risk factors become interest rates, insurance costs, and relocation decisions. This is where the antagonist shows itself clearly. It isn't Brussels, it isn't a politician, it is the bond market, the bondholders, the global investors who decide every day how expensive it is for Britain to borrow money. A country with a bad reputation pays more to fund itself. That cost flows into everything. Then came the get Brexit done phase, the moment the noise became unbearable and the country chose closure over caution. The deal that followed didn't feel like a guillotine. It felt like paperwork. But paperwork is the modern border wall. When Britain left the single market and customs union at the end of 2020, the new reality arrived at ports and warehouses. Forms, checks, delays, certifications, compliance costs. For large corporations, it was painful but manageable. For small exporters, it was lethal. Imagine a small British food producer trying to sell into Europe. Before, it was a shipment. After, it became a procedure, a file, a fee, a risk of spoilage. That kind of friction doesn't just reduce profit, it deletes the business model. So exports didn't explode. They struggled. Supply chains didn't adapt quickly. They rerouted away from the UK. Firms don't stay loyal to flags. They stay loyal to efficiency. And efficiency is where Britain began bleeding. Then the labor market tightened like a knot. Ending free movement wasn't just cultural, it was operational. Industries that relied on flexible European labor suddenly faced gaps they couldn't fill fast. Farms needed pickers, logistics needed drivers, hospitals needed staff, restaurants needed workers. Shortages don't just mean slower service, they mean higher costs. If you cannot hire, you raise wages to compete. That sounds good until you realize those wage rises aren't coming from higher productivity. They're coming from scarcity. And scarcity-driven wage rises often translate into price rises. So Britain got trapped between low growth and high inflation. That trap has a name, and it's an ugly one. Stagflation. The economy isn't expanding enough to lift living standards, but prices keep rising anyway. It feels like drowning on dry land. Now we reach the smoking gun moment. Not a battlefield, a document, a meeting, a fiscal announcement that showed the world Britain had lost its grip. In September 2022, the Liz Truss mini-budget landed like a match thrown into a room filled with gas fumes. The plan was simple in rhetoric and suicidal on a balance sheet. Big tax cuts, funded by borrowing, offered without a credible plan to pay. It was a message to markets that the adults had left the building. The bond market heard it, and it responded with violence. Bond yields jumped. The pound fell again. But the real horror was inside pension funds using complex strategies tied to stable bond prices. When bond prices fell too fast, those funds faced margin calls. They needed cash immediately, so they sold assets, which pushed prices down further. A doom loop. The Bank of England had to intervene to stop a systemic collapse. Let that sink in. A central bank stepping in because the state had frightened the market so badly that retirement money was at risk. This wasn't politics anymore. This was a foreclosure threat against national stability. And here is the brutal dialogue, paraphrased in the language markets actually speak. We don't believe you. We don't trust you. We will not lend cheaply to you. That is what the yield spike means. It is the market's way of saying, your balance sheet looks reckless. Trust didn't last, but the damage did. A risk premium became embedded into the UK. That premium is a silent tax. It raises borrowing costs for the government. It raises mortgage rates for families. It raises financing costs for businesses. It is the price of lost credibility. This is the climax, the default, without the formal declaration. The moment when money doesn't literally disappear, but becomes too expensive to access without pain. The moment where the country realizes sovereignty is not a flag. It is a funding rate. Sovereignty is solvency. Say it again, because it's the core lesson. Sovereignty is solvency. If you rely on global capital, you are never fully free. You are renting freedom at an interest rate set by strangers. And the social consequences are not cinematic. They are grey and humiliating. Higher mortgage payments, higher food bills, crumbling public services, longer waits, lower trust. The slow decay of the public realm that makes a rich country feel poor. The UK didn't become poorer because it forgot how to work. It became poorer because the economic plumbing got clogged, the investment engine stalled, and the cost of doing business rose. Britain started paying more for less, and that is the definition of decline. Now, the generational aftermath. This kind of damage doesn't vanish after an election cycle. It becomes baked into a decade. Young people inherit fewer options, higher costs, and weaker growth. Older voters keep the memory of a past Britain, while the young live in a Britain that can't afford that memory. Even if policies shift, trust rebuilds slowly, trade relationships heal slowly, investment confidence returns slowly, and lost years of compounding growth are not recoverable by speeches. You cannot make up for a decade of weak investment with a slogan. Brexit was sold as liberation. On the ledger, it looks like self-imposed friction. A country built a wall in front of its own cash flow and then argued about who should pay for repairs. The tragedy isn't that Britain chose change. The tragedy is that it chose cost without a reliable revenue replacement. So here's the final takeaway, the one that belongs in your spine. Nations don't fall when they lose battles. They fall when the balance sheet stops working, when cash becomes scarce, when credit becomes expensive, when confidence becomes a luxury item. If you want to stay ahead of the next economic thriller hiding inside headlines, subscribe to the channel. Because history is written by accountants, and the ledger always tells the truth first. The wound didn't close after 2022. It just became normal. Like living with a limp and calling it character. Britain kept operating, trains kept running, pubs kept pouring. But the ledger had already rewritten the country's daily reality in smaller numbers and tighter margins. Look at how decline actually feels. It is not fireworks. It is a rent increase that beats your pay rise. It is a grocery bill that grows teeth. It is an ambulance that takes hours because the system has no slack left. In a healthy economy, growth is quiet and constant. It shows up as better tools, faster work, higher output per hour. That output becomes wages, taxes, and public services. When that engine stalls, the country doesn't collapse. It simply can't improve. Brexit turned Britain into a nation that pays a penalty for moving. Every shipment becomes a test. Every hire becomes a paperwork decision. Every expansion plan needs a risk premium baked in, like insurance against political chaos. And the cruel part is this. Britain still has talent, universities, infrastructure, and global connections. But talent doesn't pay bills without scale. A country needs markets. It needs smooth access. It needs frictionless cash flow. The City of London survived, but it stopped being inevitable. Before, it was the default gateway for global finance into Europe. After, it became one option among several, and money loves options because options lower costs. So some activity shifted. Not with a dramatic stampede, but with a slow leak. A desk moves here, a team moves there, a trading book gets duplicated, a legal entity relocates. Each move is small, but the compounding loss is enormous. Now zoom out to the country's real economy, the places without skyscrapers, the Midlands, the North, coastal towns. These areas don't live on derivatives and legal fees. They live on factories, logistics, and predictable demand. When trade slows, the first pain hits manufacturers. Modern manufacturing is not British parts in, British goods out. It is global components assembled with timing down to the hour. Add border friction, and the clock starts slipping. A delayed shipment is not just late. It is a production line that stops breathing. And when production stops, overtime disappears. Then shifts disappear. Then jobs disappear. The tragedy arrives wearing a high-vis vest. Brexit was sold as a return to sovereignty, but supply chains don't respect sovereignty. Supply chains respect speed. If you cannot guarantee speed, you become expensive. If you become expensive, you become optional. Now let's talk about the hidden tax, duplicated compliance. Companies that once used one set of rules now pay for two systems, two audits, two labels, two legal opinions, two customs processes. That is deadweight, and deadweight kills competitiveness. Deadweight also kills small businesses first. Big multinationals can absorb the cost and hire specialists. Small firms can't. They stop exporting, shrink their ambitions, and focus only on the domestic market. That means less growth and less resilience. Britain's domestic market is not big enough to replace a continent next door. It is not a substitute for seamless access to hundreds of millions of customers. No speech can change geography, and the ledger always charges extra for denial. Then comes the psychological break. Investors do not only price profits, they price stability. A country that looks calm attracts capital like gravity. A country that looks volatile must offer higher returns to tempt money in. That's how the trust tax works. If investors demand higher yields, government borrowing costs rise. Those costs ripple outward into mortgages, business loans, and the cost of financing infrastructure. Suddenly, the future gets more expensive. And when the future is expensive, governments postpone fixes. Repairs get delayed. Maintenance becomes a luxury. Schools wait. Hospitals stretch. Roads crumble. Decline becomes visible not in charts, but in concrete. Think about what that does to politics. When people feel poorer, they demand solutions that feel immediate. But the economic damage is structural, and structural fixes take time. That gap creates anger, and anger creates more instability. So the cycle feeds itself. Instability raises the risk premium. The risk premium raises costs. Higher costs reduce growth. Reduced growth creates more instability. It is a tightening loop, like a belt pulled one notch every year. Now, the most brutal detail. Britain can still borrow because it is not bankrupt in the formal sense. But there is a difference between borrowing and thriving. Borrowing can keep the lights on. Thriving requires a strong cash engine. That cash engine is productivity and investment. Brexit hit both by adding friction and uncertainty. The country didn't lose its ability to work. It lost part of its ability to turn work into rising living standards. And that is why the poorest in the G7 idea lands as a fear, even if Britain is not literally poor. In rich country terms, poverty is relative decline. It is watching peers pull away while you tread water. Let that image sink in. The G7 is a race of compounding. If you miss a few years of speed, you don't just lose a few miles. you lose the entire advantage of momentum. Catching up later costs far more than staying steady. Now remember the phrase, because it is the final moral. Sovereignty is solvency. When you make choices that reduce solvency, sovereignty becomes theater. You can wave a flag, but the bond market sets the price of your promises.